You might think that when we get together like this, the people who take part in the service are just saying whatever comes into their head, or they're being inspired in the moment. It may not always be obvious, but in actual fact, nearly all of what happens when we get together, either here online or in person, is done with a lot of purpose, with a lot of thought. It doesn't happen by accident, whether that's the choice of the music, the work done with and through the children, or even down to the list of prayer suggestions in our bulletin. It's done with purpose. When I introduce myself, I tend to say that I get to be the minister at the West Church, and again, that's not by accident. I mean it. I'm not made to say it, I choose to say it, and I say it because what I don't do grudgingly. I do it because I think it's what I was supposed to do, it's what I was made for, it's something I'm privileged to do. If we're talking about phrases that people use a lot, I tend to refer to this book as the collection of books we call the Bible. And that's because on purpose I want to remind us that this is not a book, but this is a library of books, a bookshelf full of books, a library of writings that tell hundreds of stories, but at the same time one God story. And at the centre of that story is the stories, the life, the death and the resurrection of a young Jewish teacher in the first century, 2,000 odd years ago in Palestine. And this young Jewish rabbi or teacher stirred things up in his own Jewish story and in the middle of the Greek and the Roman culture by the kind of things he says and what he does. And we've been following that in a book called Luke, and we're going to take a break for a few weeks and just look at some particular core values that come out of this collection. At the time Jesus is living, the Jewish situation was one of poverty and oppression. The Roman Empire had them under their boot. There were a few of them who didn't mind because they were kept rich and kept comfortable in their situation, but for most people that was not what they had been promised. They believed they were meant to be blessed, and that their God was somebody who rescued and somebody who'd made them and had chosen them, and they hoped that things would get back to the way they preferred. Waiting to get back to how things were. Does that sound a familiar hope? In this collection, during some of the worst times in their people's history and stories, God would speak through people inspired called prophets. And in these writings that had been collected, there were vague ideas about a person, somebody who would come and help sort things out, a priest, a prophet, a king, a Messiah. And the common assumption was that this Messiah would be a warrior king, would come and raise up a new empire, smash the Romans, who were the current problem, and then have a real kingdom of Israel, maybe a new empire. Bit by bit in his life, Jesus of Nazareth takes these expectations apart, revealing that that's too limited for this God, that their assumptions about their scriptures and about their own position were too small, that God was doing more, that he was facing and defeating all sorts of enemies, not just the Romans. Something called sin, the addictions they had to mucking things up, and all the barriers that got between them and each other, and them and their God, and them and their creation, the creation around them. Jewish teachers had, at the time, a love of getting around and discussing their commands. They called them their Torah. And some might joke that that is a human way of trying to not deal with what's actually in them, to just talk about them and around them. So there were all sorts of common discussions. One was about which of all the different commands, and there are about 613 in their Jewish writings, which was the most light, which meant it didn't apply so much, and the heavy, the ones that were more important. So which ones were more important than others? Another common thing to discuss was how you could sum them all up. Could you sum them all up instead of having to work and remember them all? So standing right in the centre of their Jewish culture and their faith in the temple, Jewish teachers are actually attacking Jesus, trying to make him make mistakes. And they ask him, what is the greatest of the commandments? Because they think if he goes one way, then they can attack him from the other side because a different group of people will feel things, or if he goes the other way, they can then attack what he's missed out on the other side. So he can't really win in this question. It's designed to trip him up. Well, he then responds by choosing, in actual fact, he cheats a little bit, 2 commands. Love God and love those around you. Love your neighbour as you love yourself. Now, we might have heard this a few times and might think this is a really simple answer, but the real brilliance of his answer is that in these 2 short phrases, he has summed up everything, but also he's done something deeply traditional that they can't argue with, because the heart of their Torah is something called the Shema, a prayer that's said twice a day by every Jew. And it's about loving your God. And then also from the heart of their Torah in Leviticus, where it says to love your neighbour as you love yourself. Jesus is saying nothing that's new, so he can't be argued with. But at the same time, by putting love at the centre, he's challenging everything that was happening at the time. He's saying the most important thing is not to obey all these commands, but to love. To love the God who loves us, to love the people around us. And the motivation for that is not to behave in a certain way to get a prize, to obey a set of rules to prove how Jewish you are. The motivation is to love and to be loved. To love because we are loved. And then we will want to live out this way. That's the reason for all these commands, to help us live out who we were made to be. Jesus says love is the only command. And love is the only test. And none of the teachers can argue with him. So it's not about behaving. It's not about storing up credit. It's not about duty. It's not about winning. It's not about me at the expense of everyone around, my brothers and sisters. Love is the only command. And love is the only test. Love, Jesus reveals, is the key to understanding all these writings and the reason that we might want to obey these commands. All the commandments, the Torah, the law, are not a duty to be obeyed, but an invitation into the life that we were made for. Jesus says the whole law and the prophets hang on these 2. The whole law and the prophets hang on these 2. I hang on these 2. We are invited, we are made to respond to challenges like this.